Welcome to episode 3 of Building Blocks with Brendan. Today I'm talking with my good friend Matthias about his new organization, the Ocean Regenerative Aquaculture. This is going to be a salty one as we talk about how seaweed and kelp can be used to better sustain our life on land. If you're interested in sustainability or how we can use the ocean as a resource to help lower our carbon footprint, this is an episode you will not want to miss. It's a really interesting story about how he started off with an initial idea, as we'll hear about, and how he pivoted to what he's doing now. What's really unique about this compared to some of the other entrepreneurs I speak to is that how involved it is working with the indigenous communities around the area, as well as working with land ownership rights to really get this organization off the ground. What I found interesting about this is an interesting way of using a resource that many of us don't consider an asset, and that would be seaweed. Typically when you think of it, or how I thought of it, would be something that ends up on your boat or ends up on the seashore. But how he's taking this fast-growing, literally weed of the sea, and utilizing its benefits to help grow crops on land is a revolutionary idea. I do think something we'll be seeing more and more. This is a great conversation, and hopefully you enjoy this episode. Like back in the MBA, you were always interested in the ocean. Like I remember you working the salmon farming, I think, or like being able to make sustainable agriculture, especially in the middle of land. So how did you come up with this ocean regenerative aquaculture? What is it? And kind of how did the idea form?
Right. So, yeah, we met back in 2018, and
Mhm.
at the time, the whole reason why I went into the MBA was to get inside in the industry of sustainable aquaculture, specifically targeting salmon conservation. So I grew up a fisherman, and I've been up and down the coast of BC. I'm pretty big homebody,
Mhm.
and my connection to fishing kind of led me to a passion for salmon, and I've always knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur one day. And I tried to connect the two, the passion with my career ambition. So I started looking at. Sorry, my dog is just going nuts. Charlie, can you relax, please? So I started looking at land-based fish farming, and so I mean, if you're in BC and you read the news frequently, you'll see that there's an article at least once a month that talks about the negative effects of net pen salmon farming,
Mhm.
which is basically farming salmon in the ocean in giant nets. Now, there's a lot of research that still needs to be done to validate these claims, and I don't really have a stance as to whether they're very they negatively impact the environment or not. I just knew that we need to scale up production of salmon in a sustainable way. So
Mhm.
that led me to pursuing land-based aquaculture, which is farming salmon in tanks on land.
Mhm.
That way you can control all the conditions, the temperature, salinity, pH, and all the waste doesn't um, flow into the ocean. So you have a wastewater treatment center where all of the effluent is
Mhm.
treated, and you don't get a huge concentration of fish waste, which
Oh, interesting.
some people would say, oh God, my dog is just all over the Jen, can you take the dog? Um, yeah. So sorry about that. Yeah. So the huge concentrations of fish and salmon
Mhm.
in the ocean can really create a large amount of waste,
Mhm.
which research has started to indicate can lead to some sort of bacteria infections, which spread into the wild fish,
Mhm.
which is obviously very detrimental to the wild stock, and that's what everyone's trying
Interesting.
to prevent is conservation of the wild salmon in British Columbia. Um, so that's kind of where my head was at when we finished the MBA, and I was starting to network with people in the industry
Yep.
around November, December before we graduated, and I was introduced to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Andrew Wright, and he is a pioneer in this space. He was the first author of the very first technical white paper on land-based fish farming. And
Oh.
there's a farm on the north end of Vancouver Island
Mhm.
called Kutera. That's owned by First Nations,
Mhm.
and that farm is the first land-based farm that was built in the entire world, and that was based off of Dr. Andrew Wright's technical white paper.
Oh wow.
So he actually sits on our advisory board right now, but he introduced me to my current business partner, David Parker, who has 25 years experience in sustainability for a large scale mining firm, Tech Resources. And so he was the VP of sustainability there for the last 5 years, and we were kind of both interested in land-based aquaculture. So I I went and got a job at a land-based farm in Agassiz in the Fraser Valley, literally doing the grunt work. So I had my waders on and I was shoveling fish poo. I was scrubbing tanks. I was getting rid of dead fish and moving them into the
Mm-hmm.
mortality bin, as they call it. And I got to share this one story because it just kind
Mm-hmm.
of highlights how much of a dirty job this was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so throughout the process of fish farming, you get mortalities, which are,
Mm-hmm.
fish die throughout each step. And once a week, the organic waste truck comes by, and you have to collect all the dead fish and put them on the road for this truck to pick up. And so I was working on this farm in January of 2020, and
Mm-hmm.
um, all of the fish were collected in buckets that had frozen because it was so cold. And so I couldn't get them out of the bucket. And so I go to the supervisor. I said, "Hey, how do you solve this?" He's like, "Oh, here, take this Tiger torch, which is essentially a propane tank that with a wand that lights on
Mm-hmm.
fire, and you basically heat it up." And so I was blasting this bucket of dead fish, essentially cooking rotten fish, and the smell was just absolutely horrendous. It was brutal, but you know, there were a few things that happened that kind of transitioned me away from that. One thing was
Mm-hmm.
that farm um, was was really heavily impacted by COVID,
Mm-hmm.
um, and we were actually looking at a partial acquisition of this farm. That fell through because of the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
but that kind of led us to other things. And
Mm-hmm.
while we were while we were networking in the land-based space, my partner David was talking with the Musqueam First Nation
Mm-hmm.
on potentially setting up a site on their territory,
Mm-hmm.
and they were interested. They said, "Yeah, like this sounds like something we would be very interested in doing, but we would
Mm-hmm.
just use the proceeds from this farm um, to and invest it in some sort of regenerative program." And so we're like, "Okay, well, how can we leverage
Oh.
that? What does that mean?"
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how we ran into seaweed farming. It's kelp cultivation. So kelp is a form of seaweed,
Mm-hmm.
brown seaweed, and the actual practice of farming it on the ocean is very simple. It's a network of anchors and ropes.
Mm-hmm.
You put seed on this rope and it grows. And kelp
Oh.
kelp is an amazing species because it grows incredibly fast. It can grow 5% of its size every day at its peak, and
Wow.
it
Okay.
sequesters yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
it sequesters 5 to 20 times more carbon than, or sorry, it captures five to
Mm-hmm.
twenty times more carbon as terrestrial trees. And so
Oh
that's kind
wow.
of how Ocean Regenerative
Mm-hmm.
was formed, is on the basis of a regenerative business,
Mm-hmm.
providing ecosystem services and providing an economic stimulation to First Nation communities across the coast, because they're looking for jobs and they're looking for new ways to invest
Mm-hmm.
and get involved in. And this is something that's very close to them, because
Mm-hmm.
seaweed is part of their heritage, and the opportunity to grow it and practice it in a profitable manner is something is very attractive to them, and we've gotten
Mm-hmm.
a lot of positive feedback on that.
That's so wild how, you'd start off literally boiling fish by accident to now kind of creating a pretty much, like you're saying, regenerative business where you're taking carbon out of the ocean, which, you always hear information about how, the carbon levels, trying to really utilize something that, I mean, prior to really recently when I was looking at, uh, I guess you could say through the MBA or through anything else, like going out to West Coast, being like, okay, learning about the ocean and everything else. Like only thing I ever knew kelp for was literally kelp masks you see on TV or something you have to always,
Yeah.
clean off your boat. But then more and more really utilizing the abundance of it to really be more effective. So when you started out, do you have familiarity with kelp, or was this an idea you had before, heard about it, or was it just something that came up in conversation and you said, okay, instead of kind of being the middleman between creating a business to help support this regenerative cycle, I'm just going to kind of go there and that'll be the business instead? Or how did it really
Yeah.
foster or start out?
So, I mean, it definitely was just an idea at first. And
Mhm,
it was my partner, David, who had brought it to my attention.
mhm,
He'd been researching it for over a year at that point.
mhm,
Um, and when we realized that the land-based
mhm,
aquaculture wasn't ready for us,
mhm.
or we weren't ready for it, so to
Yeah.
say, um, he said, "Well, have a look at this." And so I read a couple research papers, and I spent about 2 months just knee deep
Mhm,
in trying to learn how this industry
mhm,
works, and even whether this industry in BC exists, which it is
mhm.
extremely nascent and young.
Yeah.
Um, but you know, the the funny thing was being open to pivoting in such an
Mhm,
abrupt way was something the MBA had really prepared me
mhm.
for. Like, you know, you were in that tech
Yeah.
entrepreneurship class, right? You remember
Yeah.
my group was originally, well, we couldn't even figure out an idea, and every time we came up with an idea, 2 weeks later we would pivot, and
Something
it
else.
was it
Yeah.
was such a letdown, and it was just soul crushing because you spend a
Mhm,
lot of time looking at something, and then you pivot. But it's such a real life
mhm.
phenomenon, and you got to
Skill.
be
Yeah.
open to it.
Now you brought up the MBA. Now I've talked to obviously through the MBA. Most of my friends are now from that program, but even talking to my friends from now, because I'm in Toronto, my friends in Toronto, people always look at an MBA as like counter to a startup or counter to entrepreneurship. I don't view it like that. I did some entrepreneurship courses through the program. I found it helped my entrepreneurship spirit and also gave me the skills. But did you find that the MBA better prepared you for the startup world, or did you think it made you too closed minded, as some people would say?
um, I don't know. I mean, I'm an engineer by background.
Yeah.
Like, I like to solve problems and get my hands
Mhm.
dirty. So I mean, I'm naturally wired to almost do before I think to some extent, which
Yeah. Mhm.
doesn't sound that productive. But I think
Mhm.
as a startup, you have to you have to have a very quick
Mhm.
iteration process and just try so many things and fail a lot before you get to a
Mhm.
point where something works. Um, and you know, we were talking to a lot of potential investors, and
Mhm.
just trying to get some
Yeah.
our advisory board figured
Yeah.
out. And a lot of times, I would present myself as like basically a fresh MBA,
Mhm.
and that actually didn't really help most of the time. And people always they always have a preconceived notion of,
Mhm.
you know, an MBA is doesn't like to physically do anything. They're just so analytical
Yeah.
and think they are talk shit, right? And
Mhm.
so I actually ran into that quite a bit. But you know, you just deal with it.
Mhm.
But I think to prove them wrong, you just show them the actual things that you do, and be very well versed in the topic so that you
Mhm.
actually know what you're
Exactly.
saying and doing, instead of just some, you know, business jargon that makes you sound smart. Um, but
So.
in terms of actual,
Mhm.
like, business activities, it's 100% helped me in prepping for fundraising,
Mhm.
in doing my market research, and you know, I think that was one of the most important activities, was doing
Mhm.
that market research. Because you know, from my understanding, one of the biggest pitfalls is that people have an idea, they chase it, and then they don't know what to do with it. And that actually summarizes the kelp industry very well
Mhm.
in British Columbia. It's really easy to farm kelp, and people who own tenure is essentially a plot of water that you have rights to.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and people who own tenure traditionally for shellfish, cultivating
Mhm,
oysters and geoduck and scallops,
mhm,
for instance, they see how well kelp grows, and so then they invest in infrastructure to grow
mhm,
kelp, and they have all this biomass, and then they don't know what to do with it. So
mhm.
that's one approach that we're trying to avoid is actually doing that market research beforehand, having an outlet, investing heavily in product
Mhm,
development before we um, build our commercial scale farms.
mhm. So how? So I know you brought that up. So you can just buy a plot of like water land. Is that how it works? And
Oh,
does the government sell it? Like, how do you get land, or how do you buy an ocean? How does this work? Is that possible, or like, kind of, is there already an industry for that, or kind of how does? Because I'm assuming there's not. Is there real estate agents who sell these things, or kind of how does that work, or is this done on land, or is it in the middle of an ocean? I know I'm
yes,
asking very
that's a
basic
good
questions,
question.
but this is all kind of new.
No, for sure. And it took me a long time to understand it too. And the funny thing is, with regard to kelp cultivation,
Hmm.
the provincial government doesn't is very understaffed, and
Hmm.
we have multiple conversations where we're getting mixed messages.
Hmm.
So that part hasn't really been completely flushed out. But in
Hmm.
general, how it works is Crown land is owned by the provincial government.
Hmm.
Um, you apply for a tenure, which basically gives you rights to a plot of land, and you have to do
Hmm.
an application through FLNRO, uh, the Department of Forest Land
Hmm.
Resource. I can't remember the exact
Hmm.
acronym, but once you have that, that process can take a really long time
Hmm.
because there's a component where you must consult with any neighboring First Nations. And so
Oh,
that is a
interesting.
very lengthy,
Hmm.
lengthy process, and it requires you to engage with First Nations, develop a relationship, and essentially get their blessing
Hmm.
to apply for this or to be able
Hmm.
to use that for aquaculture. So that process can take years,
Oh, wow.
and then on top of that, you also need to apply um, for a aquaculture license. So just to show you how complex it is right now, all aquaculture licenses, finfish, shellfish,
Hmm.
that's all governed by the DFO, which is a federally regulated body.
Hmm.
And the tenures are regulated by the provincial government. Now, aquaculture licenses for kelp
Yeah.
and sea plants is regulated also by the provincial government. So the approach we're taking now, because the quickest way to
Hmm.
get access to tenure is to work with existing shellfish tenure owners,
Interesting. Hmm.
um, because they already have the tenure. Now all you need to do is amend their aquaculture license to
Hmm.
include sea plants. And so that's
Oh,
kind of taken us a few months to figure out
yeah.
how to do, and even that amendment application takes up to
Hmm.
8 months.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
but it's a really, really slow process, and right now, that is 100% the bottleneck that is
Hmm.
preventing this industry from growing quickly. Because there's many, many mom and pop businesses that want to cultivate kelp,
Hmm.
but it's just such a daunting task to apply for this, knowing that it's going to take
Hmm.
years to actually get approved, and you have to do all these consultations.
Hmm.
Um, so we're eventually we're going to have to start lobbying the government to work on this because
Hmm.
it is inhibiting the industry, and the industry has so many positive benefits that
Yeah.
um, it's it's really hurting everybody.
Now, I know obviously you're in BC, kind of the West Coast. Is the oceans there? It's obviously much more apparent than other places in the world. Is there a hot spot for kelp growing? Like, is North America known as good places, or places in Europe, or is it globally quite a new industry overall?
That's a really good question. I'm not the biologist on the team,
Hmm.
but what I can say is that in BC there's over 600 different species of seaweed,
Oh,
um,
wow.
and each species has different uh, has grows better in different areas, right? They all have
Oh, yeah.
preferred
Hmm.
environmental conditions. The species that we're cultivating
Mm-hmm.
on the first instance is sugar kelp or
Ooh.
Laminaria saccharina,
Ooh.
and they that specific species likes cool, fast-moving water, a certain temperature throughout the growing period, a certain
Mm-hmm.
salinity. It doesn't like fresh water, so staying away from big river mouths, etc. So we've done such little research as an industry,
Mm-hmm.
not just our company, but in
Mm-hmm.
general on the Pacific seaweeds,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of cultivation, that we're just at the beginning. Like we're looking at one or two species right now, trying to figure out
Mm-hmm.
what are the ideal conditions. We have an idea, and there is some research that supports it.
Mm-hmm.
But down the road, right, we want to optimize our yield, how much we
Mm-hmm.
can grow, and that is going to mean experimenting with new species and
Yeah.
experimenting with new conditions.
That's so exciting, so huge. I mean, you think about farming. That's I don't know however old humans are, that old of an industry, and how many different species of even corn. You look at corn within North America, how the industry's changed so much, and what we see as corn today is much different than what was in the past. So I mean, it sounds so exciting that you're literally figuring out a new way to farm things that hasn't really been commercialized successfully or utilized to its full degree, and it's something where you're almost, instead of, like you said before with the salmon, instead of damaging land and ruining land to grow crops and grow other things, you're literally using the ocean, using something that's naturally grown there to better off the ocean and to kind of replace a lot of other issues and other industries that are being created. Now, you get to see, so I'm assuming, I actually don't know how this works. Someone collects the seaweed. I don't know if it's done, I'm assuming a machine, or does a scuba diver collect it, or how does that work? I don't know if you're aware, but then from there, what are the next steps with it? Is there a process to get it to integrate within soil? Kind of what do you do with the seaweed once you have it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our company is looking at a few different outlets, but
Mm-hmm.
the first thing we're looking at is um, processing the raw seaweed into something that's called a biostimulant. So a
Mm-hmm.
biostimulant, it's like a fertilizer, but it's very different. So
Mm-hmm.
imagine a fertilizer is it's packed with nutrients like NPK, nitrogen,
Mm-hmm.
potassium, and phosphorus.
Mm-hmm.
And what it does is it gives plants the nutrients it needs to grow. So that's what fertilizer does. A
Yeah.
biostimulant is different because when you apply it to soils and plants, it actually changes the physiology of the plant so that it can absorb those nutrients better, which
Oh,
makes it
wow.
grow larger and has a lot of other positive benefits,
Mm-hmm.
um, without adding any high concentrations of synthetic
Mm-hmm.
minerals like the NPK. Like fertilizers are very highly processed, and
Yeah.
if you over fertilize, can be very
Mm-hmm.
detrimental to your crops.
Mm-hmm.
So biostimulants use organic matter to basically stimulate the plant
Mm-hmm.
to be more efficient um, and improves its immune system so that it can resist abiotic stresses and biotic stresses like like pest
Mm-hmm.
infestations, or the major one is severe climate changes. And
Oh,
our
interesting.
whole value proposition is, climate change is real. Every year,
Mm-hmm.
people, let's call it people in the Okanagan, they're facing more extreme single day rain events, so isolated rain events. Let's use grapes because
Yeah.
there are initial target markets right now.
Yeah.
So grape growers, the grapes really love hot, dry, consistently dry
Mm-hmm.
climate, right? With climate change, we're seeing more and more isolated, really heavy rainfall events.
Mm-hmm.
And these rainfall events severely damage the plants, the vines, and
Mm-hmm.
it triggers mildew, an outbreak of mildew, which also kills plants and can slow down the growth of
Mm-hmm.
it. And so basically, a biostimulant pumps up its immune system to resist these kinds of stresses, and is essentially an insurance policy for growers
Mm-hmm.
against the increasing effects of climate change.
Interesting. That's That's like you're saying, an industry I knew nothing about. I mean, I bought some fertilizer for my own house plants, and even that on the simple side is pretty complex as well because there's so many
Yeah,
options, so many
and
different things.
just to be clear, we're not a biostimulant does not replace fertilizers. It's
Yeah.
complementary. It's
Hmm.
plants still need the nutrients, the
Hmm.
NPK, but biostimulants just make the plant it make its ability to
Hmm.
absorb it and use it much more efficient.
And when you brought up grape growers, is there a certain specific industry that you were targeting more? Would it be agriculture, certain types of crops, certain types of growers, or is it an industry wide thing?
Yeah, this is a really complicated question, and
Hmm.
I don't want to get into it too technically,
Yeah.
but um, the way that biostimulants are manufactured, it's
Hmm.
basically a liquid seaweed extract. Seaweed is packed with
Hmm.
micronutrients and growth hormones, and depending on how you process it and how you
Hmm.
extract it, it can address different characteristics on the
Oh.
plant.
Oh wow.
So you're essentially designing your process to the market that you want to address.
Interesting.
So one of the reasons why we're looking at grape growers is a it's,
Hmm.
we both like wine and it's in our basically in
Yeah.
our backyard.
Hmm.
Two, they're quite a high value crop.
Yeah.
Um, I have a pretty interesting stat. So in BC, there are 929 vineyards, and the wine industry is about $2.8 billion. So that means um,
Hmm.
if you break it down to value per acre, each acre of vineyard is worth $270,000. What does that mean? That means that
Ooh.
wine growers find their land is
Hmm.
extremely valuable, and they will invest in the longevity um, and the health of the
Hmm.
soils. And so we've interviewed a number of growers who are basically sharing us what are their pain points and
Hmm.
what are the things that they're looking to achieve. And
Hmm.
that's the approach we're taking. Depending on how you process your biostimulant, you can address a number of different crops and a number of different perennials, or from
Hmm.
berries to wheat to grains to anything. But we find it important to stay focused. Start with
Yeah.
one. Let's
Yeah.
cross the chasm with one, and then
Hmm.
go from there. There's just so much research that needs to be done, and a very large amount of the research that has been done on
Hmm.
seaweed liquid extracts has been on Pacific species, specifically Ascophyllum nodosum,
Hmm.
um, and there's been much less research done on the Pacific species.
That's wild. Even though I spent a good many years in BC, not over 900 vineyards is wild. Just because Canada's so small, first of all, like population wise. No, there's
Yeah,
900 people growing grapes for wine specifically, or for consumption is wild.
yeah,
Especially because there's not that many people there. If you think about it, only a few million population, and that's a
yeah,
huge proportion growing wine. So interesting that the industry kind of how technical it really is. It's not something where you're just throwing seaweed on a plant and hoping for the best. There is a lot of science, a lot of different ways of kind of like you're saying, better prepare a crop or better prepare specific an industry to meet certain needs or certain growing criteria.
yeah.
For growing you know the seaweed, is it how big is like square footage? Like, do you have to have like multiple water acres? I don't know if there's like a different term, like how there's knots for boats, like water
Yeah,
acres, or is
yeah.
it like can you have it quite like multiple smaller growing stations? Kind of like how is that work? I guess, or how big does it have to be?
That's also a good question. It doesn't. It We're going to select our sites based on
Mhm.
how productive they are.
Okay. Hmm.
That means we're testing a number of
Hmm.
sites before we actually build a commercial
Yeah.
farm, and that might mean that in one area, for instance, we'll deploy a 5 hectare farm. The space,
Hmm.
as you're referencing, we measure it in hectares,
Hmm.
which is I think 2 point something acres,
Yeah.
or something like that.
Hmm.
Anyways, we have a target as to how many hectares of farm we want to
Mhm.
actually attain and how much tenure we
Mhm.
want to have access to. And we can't say though if they're all going to be in one location or the other.
Mhm.
There is such thing as too much of a good thing.
Mhm.
Can have negative impacts even when you're growing kelp because kelp needs to feed on something, right? It
Yeah.
feeds on the natural nutrients in the ocean, and so if you're growing so much in an area, like you
Mhm.
can deplete that area of the ocean of its nutrients, which can then
Mhm.
impact other marine animals. Um, that's one of the reasons why you want high flow areas where the
Mhm.
nutrients are constantly getting mixed in,
Mhm.
and are readily available. Um, yeah, so a few hectares of farm is what we're
Mhm.
scheduled to build this year.
Oh
And
wow.
then we're hoping to grow quite quickly over the next 5 years. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, at the same time, continue the R&D and testing of this biostimulant product.
That's so exciting. It's such a unique perspective. I mean, even speaking with you prior, your love for the ocean, kind of love for the agricultural side of things. It started with the salmon and the fishies, and you kind of posting photos during the whole NBA with your boat and being on the ocean. It really was a huge passion for you. But also on the other side of things, it's interesting because most of the people, you speak to in our MBA or you speak to other parts of the, they have an app or they have something where it's almost like I wouldn't say a quick buck, but something where the implications are never really that positive. Where on your end, you're not only like it's a passion of yours, it's a unique product, but also it's down the road, multiple years from now, it's benefiting an industry or benefiting Canada and the world much more than a purely tech based thing, which I feel especially is quite unique, especially being relatively younger compared to in the corporate world.
Mhm.
It's surprising kind of to see that this unique project, which I would assume is only a growing industry. It's very rare. I mean, renewable resources, renewable, upcycling, different types of these buzzwords, which I actually learned much more in Vancouver, how it's going to be such a big industry coming and going in the future. Now, is is it when you're growing the kelp and kind of forming the business, is there any challenges with like distribution in a sense that like if you grow it in one spot, can it be transported across Canada, across North America, or is this primarily? I know you're saying you're starting off small, but when it comes to expansion, is this something that can really be used everywhere, or is it very specific to kind of a Canadian-based thing?
Are you referring to the ability to cultivate it or the ability to scale it up in BC and actually distribute the product?
I guess a little bit of both. Like, I guess that was a
Yeah.
poor question, but the question is, if you were to grow this in BC, is it possible to scale enough in BC to like um or kind of is BC or on these hectares of land,
Yeah.
how big is that scale? Like, can it be enough to service like a North America industry, or is it one of those things where like as you grow, you'll have to keep expanding to other ocean? Well, there's only really two oceans, but like other geographic locations. Kind of
Yeah.
how does that work?
No, I got the question now. Um, yeah, so British Columbia has approximately 25,000 kilometers of coastline.
Mhm.
It's big, and it's not even remotely utilized to its
Mhm.
capacity. There is so much water out there. There's so much coastline, that we have not considered going international in the first
Mhm.
10 years, just to give you
Oh wow. Mhm.
context. Um, there has been a lot of hype around offshore kelp cultivation for the
Mhm.
sole purpose of sequestering and capturing carbon.
Yeah.
Um, but that's a whole nother beast,
Mhm.
and it's essentially an engineering challenge more than
Yeah.
a business challenge. But yeah, I mean, British Columbia is so big and has so much potential to grow this industry that We haven't really considered going outside just yet.
Hmm.
This is happening quite extensively in Norway, in Japan, and
Cool.
New Zealand, strangely enough. Um,
Hmm.
and they're all innovating new ways to cultivate it, which is really
Yeah.
exciting. Like this this process of actually cultivating and harvesting seaweed is incredibly labor intensive and
Interesting.
manual. There's so much room for innovation and
Hmm.
optimization, and that's kind of what gets me excited is the ability to improve and
Hmm.
design and engineer this entire process. Like just to give you context, the
Hmm.
way that people are doing it today in BC is the same way they've
Hmm.
been doing it since the 60s.
Oh wow.
Nothing has really changed. Nothing significant has changed,
Yeah.
and that's just because the industry hasn't been that successful
Hmm.
in British Columbia. And my hypothesis on that is because there hasn't really been a market for it for the
Hmm.
products, and times are changing. Like people in North America are becoming more health conscious. They're becoming
Hmm.
more environmentally conscious. They're understanding that the world needs to come up with new forms of nutrition. You
Hmm.
know, like in in 30 years, um, the 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 agricultural output
Hmm.
and food demand is predicted to increase like 60%. There's no way we
Yeah.
can do that by um, by farming on land. That just is not going to
Hmm.
happen. And that's why, we need to make sure that the land that is used for producing food is used efficiently.
Hmm.
Um, and B, we need to start feeding ourselves through the ocean and using the nutrition of seafood to feed
Hmm.
ourselves. And it's just crazy that a place like British Columbia still eats so much red meat. Like
Hmm.
we live on the coast, like we eat way more red meat than seafood, and it's
Hmm.
crazy that that is happening. And yeah, I think I completely avoided your question, but
No, that no
I,
that was good.
I digressed a little bit.
Mhm. No, but it's kind of just touching on that quickly, and then we'll end up real soon. It was kind of interesting how you were saying how I know ever since you were in like elementary school, they're like the ocean is 80% of the Earth is the ocean. But when I mean, I personally don't like seafood, but even when it came to like figuring out, oh, like how can we use the ocean or kind of utilize all that space, it's wild how there has been a huge push into the aquaculture effectively, obviously humanely and net carbon neutral, but how
Mhm.
even something seaweed been around forever. I'm pretty sure people have been eating versions of it forever, but now utilizing it to actually get better yields on land, but also eventually have a similar to I'm assuming how we grow corn or anything else, kind of have a production system to utilize the ocean to get food on the plate rather than constantly, like you're saying, having to eat red meat, very labor intensive, bad for relatively carbon heavy production cycle, especially red meat and cows. It's wild how
Yeah,
literally a stone throw away in BC there's the ocean, and so few of us look at it as a way of food, nutrition,
yeah,
and just utilizing it more effectively.
yeah, yeah. Us in BC, we didn't really need to rely on seaweed
Hmm.
in the last couple of centuries to stimulate the economy. On the East Coast, they all they had was seafood, and all they had was fishing,
Hmm.
and that's one of the reasons why the cod fishery was completely decimated and wiped out
Hmm.
because that was one of the biggest industries. And in BC, we had lots of mining activity going on,
Hmm.
and it wasn't
True.
really needed.
Interesting.
Like we didn't really need to lean on the ocean too much. So you know,
Hmm.
it's happening now though, and I really think that people are becoming more and more aware of the benefits of
Hmm.
seaweed and its potential to not only benefit the environment but
Hmm.
also the socioeconomic impact it can have along the coast
Hmm.
and indigenous nations along the coast. And
Sure.
they,
And,
it, yeah.
no, I was gonna say if people want to kind of follow along the story, kind of follow along the business, what's the best place? Do you have a website? Do you kind of mostly post on LinkedIn? Kind of how can people follow along?
Yeah, so we launched our website in December.
Mhm,
It's www.oceanregenerative.com. And there's, you can follow our news stories, the things that we're
mhm.
doing, and you can follow us on LinkedIn as well. Seem to be quite active on that. Working on getting some of our other social media platforms up and running, but right now it's just me and David, so we're
Mhm.
spread a little bit thin, but we're working on it.
That's so exciting. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. And I mean, your story is amazing. This is one of the more unique businesses that I've ever spoken to, or I even know someone who's running, and for sure something that will only grow in popularity and grow in demand in the coming years.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me on, Brendan. It was
All right.
tons of fun. Great to reconnect.